When I was still living back in the Detroit area, I attended a lecture at a law school, the Detroit College of Law. And the main speaker for that evening was a guy named Dennis Archer. Dennis Archer is fairly well known in the city of Detroit. He was a lawyer who had a part of a very successful law firm at that time. But at the time in which I heard him speak, he was actually he was a judge on the Michigan State Supreme Court. Some years later after that, he would run for and be elected as mayor of Detroit for several terms. So he was fairly well known. In going to this lecture, I was expecting, because he's lecturing those law students who are graduating and then those freshmen and all the ones in between. And I'm going there thinking that his objective is to encourage them as they get out into the world of law. And to be able to tell them, you guys are going into a practice that it's a service industry. People need to understand what it is when they get out into the legal world and they're overwhelmed by all the laws and regulations, and you are there to help them. So go out and take your profession seriously and serve people. That's what I thought the objective would be. But for 54 minutes, what I listened to was a guy get up there and exhort these young people, these young minds of much, as to how much money they could make. And he had this all cabled in his head. You can go to this law firm and you can make $95,000 a year. And he's doing, as he's going through all of this, you got these bunch of lawyers who are hooping and hollering, yeah, and they're high-fiving one another. That's great, And I'm telling you, here's what I make as a judge right now, and you can do this and you can make that. Completely different objective. And I'm looking around thinking to myself, is anybody else missing this? But then I went to the lawyer. John chapter 2 is a composite of conflicting objectives. In fact, it's what comprises the entire chapter. One of them is sincere, the other is sinful. Similar issues are involved, but the objectives in meeting these issues are very, very different from one another. And we all face this, as this example just showed. We all face conflicting objectives in trying to navigate our lives. We may come to a conclusion as a father, as a mother, in a family. I want to provide the best family life and income that I can for my family. And you have to decide what that is. And maybe as a couple, you think to yourself, a 1,200 square foot home isn't what I want. I want a 2,500 square foot home. Well, it's not for me to decide. Maybe that is best for your family. I don't know. Or I'd like my family to have a boat because I want us to be able to go out in the summertime and do fishing. But you know what? To accomplish that may require a whole lot more hours for you to work every week. And you got to decide whether you're defeating the purpose in the long run. Do I spend more time at work or less time at work and more time with the family? Well, this tension in conflicting objectives is what happens to the Lord Jesus Christ on two occasions in John chapter 2. Now, just so you kind of understand the flow of what's happening here, his ministry began in chapter 1. His miracles begin here in chapter 2, and his message will formally begin in chapter 3, which we'll begin in next week. But here in John 2, his first conflicting objective had to do with a wedding in Cana, where he prematurely performed his first miracle, his first sign. We saw this in verses 1 through 11. The second incident involves the temple in Jerusalem, in verses 12 down through verse 25. During the Passover, in which he cites his first prophetic fulfillment. So if you want to open to John chapter 2, and again, we'll put this up on the screen for you, just reviewing briefly, because we looked at the first part of this a few weeks back, reviewing briefly what happens at the wedding in Cana. What you have is a sincere difference here. A sincere difference in objectives is seen in Mary's insistence that her son maintain the formal structure of this wedding that she seems to be a part of. She seems to have some role in organizing all of this. And when something goes wrong at the wedding, she turns to her son, who she knows is special. And she wants him to fix this through his divine power. Now that is a very honest and sincere objective that she has. We do this a lot. Especially in sincerity, a lot of times. We come to the Lord Jesus Christ and we tell him, hey, Jesus, something is wrong in my life. And whatever it takes, would you please fix this? And sometimes Jesus will respond to us, well, not now. or not in this way. But you don't understand, Jesus. In the last year, I put on 25 pounds. Can you just do some kind of a hyper-cosmic liposuction and take care of it? And he's kind of going to go, why don't you first just try cutting back on the French fries and exercising? Let's talk about this again in a year. So here's the issue. Jesus and his disciples are invited to a wedding where he has no plans to reveal his power or his glory. But Mary has a crisis. The wedding formality is threatened, and this is important to her. There's nothing wrong in that. That is perfectly normal. But there are other ways to resolve this. There are more conventional ways. She could have just sent someone back into the nearest town to buy some more wine. But for Jesus, the issue goes much deeper. Look at his response to his mother's concern. Let's pick it up in verse 3 and 4. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus says to him, they have no wine. Now you kind of get a picture what is taking place here. Jesus is invited to the wedding. You can kind of get this picture. They're just kind of in the back of the crowd, just kind of watching everybody else. And all of a sudden, his mother runs up. Jesus, what? They have no wine. Verse 4, he says to her, well, woman, what does it have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. What you find here is that Jesus is very emphatic in his response because he sees the tension in objectives rising here. But after all, what are you going to do? It's your mother. So he has a dilemma here. Timing is bad, even if the family ties are really close. Every family has somebody like this. Every family's got that Uncle Frank, or that brother-in-law. And they constantly need something from you, especially if you're the guy in the family who has the pickup truck. Hey, I got a couch to move. Can you come over and help me? What, again? Who was it? Uncle Frank. I got to go help the guy. Everybody's got someone like that in the family. Well, she wants something powerful from her son, who she knows is also her Lord. But for Jesus, he has a totally opposite objective. His primary concern is always his glory. Because the fulfillment of his glory is the only true effective solution to any problem that we face in life. And the reason why is because glorification and belief must go hand in hand. Glorification and belief, that is you see that in verse 11. He says this is the beginning of his signs that Jesus did in Galilee. It manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. That's the only indication John gives here, is that doing this miracle, only his disciples really believed in him. Now, it's important to note here that the writer, John, is very deliberate in the use of his word sign. It's really not translated as the word miracle in the language. Now, some translations do use English miracle. That's not wrong. It's just not specific enough. There are basically 4 Greek words. I'm not going to tell you what they are, it doesn't matter. But they basically are translated in English with like signs or powers or wonders or works. And these are used because there's no one single term that can exhaust all the significance of what a miracle is. Those kind of words portray miracles from different perspectives and with different purposes here. So Jesus wants his works always to point to something greater, and that is his glory. So the fact is, yes, this is a miracle, but it is meant as a sign to point to something else. It's kind of like this. It's kind of like if you go to your best friend or whatever and you say, hey, I need a ride to the airport tomorrow morning at 8. Do you have a car? Yeah, I got a car. Okay, so if you have a car, can you get in your car and pick me up tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, take me to the airport? And he says, yeah, I'll do that. So at 8 o'clock, you're outside waiting for him to drive up in his car, but he doesn't drive up in a car. He drives up in a Cadillac. A Cadillac is a car, absolutely, but oh man, it points to something else, something greater. All of Jesus' miracles are meant to point to something greater. But this objective here threatens that. I mean, he's turning water into wine. That's altering the laws of physics. You can't alter the laws of physics just to rescue the wedding party. But he does it. He does it for his own divine prerogative, of which we, as readers, later on can extract his glory at work. We looked at this in detail a few weeks ago. Just in brief, to remind ourselves, here's what he does, verse 6. Stone water, there for the custom of purification, containing 20 to 30 gallons of water. The point being is that these are dirty water pots. These are water pots that are used for when people show up and they wash their face and their hands and their feet in them. Then in verse 7, he tells the servants, I want you to take those same water pots and fill them to the brim with fresh water. Now, he doesn't tell them, dump them out, scrub them, because that's what you kind of expect. Scrub them, because I'm going to do something really cool with them, and I don't want to have dirty water in there. No, he tells them, take that water that's in there and fill them up with fresh water. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that when you add dirty water to fresh water, the fresh water doesn't make the dirty water clean. So the fresh water becomes contaminated. So when we look back at this, we begin to extract things. This is a picture of life. No matter how much I try to make my life clean on its own, something always enters in to dirty it up. Only Jesus can transform a life, the purest wine, into something better and cleaner and better tasting and more righteous and lasting. And it also reveals that there is a coming change, a coming cosmic dispensation in God's divine plans, which is passing of the old system of Jewish religious ceremony into the new and living hope in Christ. The problem is, none of this would be seen in the moment of this miracle. Why? Why? Because different objectives were at work. No one at that lecture that I attended, not any lawyer sitting there listening to Dennis Archer, would know that there was a greater calling to their life outside of it being how much money you can make. Well, this is the issue here. The crisis for Mary, which brings out a premature revealing of Christ's glory. Here's the outcome. Jesus is glorified. He is. But only in an immediate, limited context. The head waiter we find here is the first to recognize it, but he doesn't make any connection to Christ. He doesn't even know that a miracle has taken place. Look at verse 9 and 10. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had now become wine, he didn't know where it came from. Now the servants who had drawn the water out, they knew. But the head waiter calls to the bridegroom, so he includes somebody else. This poor old bridegroom is just kind of out there, dancing with his bride and with other people out there. He gets called over, and it's kind of reamed for this in verse 10. Head waiter says to him, hey, look, every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poor wine. But you've kept the good wine until now. You have broken protocol. And you can kind of picture the bridegroom going, oh, whoa, hey, enhance your calm, man. I don't know what's going on here. What are you saying has happened here? So he doesn't know anything. The head waiter doesn't know anything. We know it, looking back. But in the moment of the miracle, it's pretty much going unnoticed. Now, Mary certainly knows it, but her motive was not the highest goal, of course. The servants know it, probably better than anyone, but we're not told what their response is. The real response, the fuller response, seems to be for us. Those of us who come along later, as we look back to the written record and we draw out these truths and these principles, which is true actually for the way the Bible presents a lot of things. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, he's telling the Corinthian church, he's reviewing their history of how they came out of Egypt and they passed through the fire and they passed through the Red Sea, which was their baptism into God's plan. And on 2 occasions, Paul says, these things were done as an example for you. Romans 15 speaks of the same kind of thing. But it leaves us with a greater question. Now, there's a lot of questions we ask about this, but this one at least must be asked to us this morning. Are you satisfied with the old wine of life that you may be drinking right now? If you're here and heaven is not a reality in your life, if forgiveness of sins and assurance of eternal life is not something you can claim right now, why not taste of the new wine of Jesus? Taste of Christ is to discover how really inferior everything else in life is that you once thought was really important. How about you, believer? For you, saint, who may be settling for an inferior wine of life right now, Jesus waits to restore you to that better tasting power of the new life he's already given you. I would tell you, don't wait any longer. The old stuff isn't worth it. You can do better. So where Mary's conflicting objective was sincere, though a bit self-serving, this next incident is sinful. And the scene now shifts. The scene is now the temple of Jerusalem. And again, you got to get the contrast here. Unlike this quiet, isolated event like a wedding way out there in the outskirts of Cana, this now is the religious hub of all Jerusalem. I mean, this is a religious hub of all of Israel. And this is where these events now become far more serious and the tensions are much, much higher. So now here is the sinful difference in objectives. It's going to be seen in the Jews' concern over financial profiteering that's taking place in the temple, upon the temple grounds, which Jesus is going to use to demonstrate a completely different purpose. He has a completely different goal in mind. Let's pick the story up in verse 12, and I'm going to read quickly down through verse 21 so you kind of get a picture of everything that's taking place here. After this, that is after the wedding in Cana, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. He made a scourge of cords, and he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. He poured out the coins of the money changers, and he overturned their tables. Now, you've got to get the big picture of verse 15 here. There's a lot of physical activity taking place on Jesus' part that he is initiating. Verse 16, and to those who were selling the doves, he said, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business." And his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "Well, what sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It took 46 years to build this temple. You're going to raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So we find here that Jesus and his family and his disciples, they make their way to Jerusalem. So apparently him and his mom have patched everything up, okay? And they're now in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. Now Passover is the most important celebration of the year for any good Jew. It was a 24-hour event, a one-day event, which commemorated Israel's deliverance from Egypt through God's power and through protection. Every good Jew would do this yearly. They would do this to go there to pay their tribute for the maintenance of the temple and the whole system that surrounded it. Jesus is a good Jew. Now, he's not there to pay his temple tax. And then after that one day of the celebration of Passover, it would be followed up by a week-long festival of unleavened bread. You got to love the Jews, man. They know how to celebrate. I love this kind of thing. And the festival of unleavened bread commemorated, because it just picked up on where Passover left off, it commemorated the haste by which they were to leave Egypt. They were not even allowed to let their bread rise. They were to take only their necessities and to get out of Egypt as quickly as possible. So Jesus, he goes to the temple immediately, not to pay his tribute, not to offer up sacrifices, but according to Matthew's account, he's going there to pray. Because when he comes in and he sees everything there, he says, "Hey, look, this is meant to be a house of prayer. You've turned it into a den of thieves." So he's there basically to pray. But when he gets in there, he is horrified at what he finds in the outer court. It's a thriving marketplace. There's banking going on. There are stalls for animals being sold. And of course, when you have festivals like this, you've got all the other residual businesses that spring up with this kind of thing. You know, you've got the Starbucks truck over there, and you've always got the booth with the elephant ears, right? And the guy selling balloons and the pony rides are over there. Of course, I'm kidding about that. But there are these residual things. People need to eat. People need to buy other things. So these kind of businesses go up. And those who did come from distant lands wouldn't bring their own sacrificial animals. Now, they were commanded to, as far as the law was concerned, but they got innovative as the centuries went by. So instead of bringing their animals, they would just come and they would purchase them there in the outer court. Why drag a lamb or a sheep or something hundreds of miles when they're going to be right there and I can buy them? Now that's not necessarily wrong, but it completely, totally lost the imagery of what it meant for someone to go out to their own flock, what they owned, and pull out the most perfect of that flock and have to kill it in a bloody fashion because of your sin. That's now all lost. And since people did come from other lands, they have other currencies. Well, of course, money needed to be exchanged and valued. And all of this led to a religious system less concerned with connecting God and covering sin and more concerned with creating and controlling profit. So here's the issue. Here's the issue. For the Jews, to keep the formalism of the temple intact was essential to them. There was a sinful motivation to much of what they did in all of this profiteering, but the greater crime was in trying to maintain a now dead religious connection to God, which is what all of this activity exemplified. So what does Jesus do? Verse 15, he makes a whip. And it's a specific term here. He makes a scourge of cords. The idea here is not Jesus kind of went off on his own for 3 or 4 hours and kind of weaved together, one of these sturdy Roman-type whips. He doesn't do that. This is a scourge, which means he probably goes to some kind of briar bush or something like that, grabs a bunch of vines, just kind of twists them all together, and he goes in there with a makeshift whip. Now that's important to understand. He doesn't have the big, powerful whip that Rome used, with the little stone stubbles in there and things. He's got just this cheap little whip. But notice what he does. He's driving people out. Animals are running all over the place. Money tables are being changed over. You can kind of picture, too, people kind of going, diving in. There's a bowl of coins over there it dumps over, and people are diving in after it. Remember this as well. The temple had temple guards to keep order. Where are they? Everybody's afraid to do anything with this guy. This is the guy who in about 3 years is going to walk like a sheep to the slaughter. He's going to allow people to arrest him, to question him, to beat him, to torture him, and to kill him. Like a sheep to the slaughter. But here, he's driving them out, and no one wants to come near him in any way. Jesus is driving them out. Why? Because he has a totally different objective. Jesus was not trying to reclaim the religious order or the religious worship of his day. He's trying to reform it. Some would even say remove it. He's not trying to retool it because somehow it's just lost its way. He's trying to replace it with a new and better one. Secondly, it was the same for Jews and Jesus. And that is, what's the function of the temple? What's it even here for? Now, if you go back in their history, 400 years, God had called Zerubbabel and others out of their captivity to rebuild the temple. But he did not call Herod to do it. And Herod is the guy, Herod the Great, Herod the First, is the guy who actually started the whole rebuilding. He didn't call him to do this. So in this grand rebuilding, they are looking to continue its program indefinitely if they can. Jesus is expecting it to contract. The entirety of the temple and its purpose and its meaning were meant to play the same role as the law of Moses was meant to play, and that was to frustrate the sinner and then point them to Messiah. That's what the law does. That's what the temple did, to frustrate them. Every time I open up this book, what? I gotta obey that too? Really? Yeah, you have to. And when you're done obeying that, there's 100 more to obey. I can't do this. I know. That's the whole point. Now you're getting the message here. In the same way that the gospel writer John conveyed in the wedding at Cana that the wine of Jesus is superior to anything that taste in life, so he conveys in this cleansing that the sacrifice of Jesus is superior to that which any animal or religious activity claims to be. In fact, his own disciples bring this whole cleansing of the temple into its proper connection of his coming death. Verse 17. When he's cleansing the temple, his disciples remembered, hey, it's written, zeal for your house will consume you. In fact, Jesus affirms this with his own response in verse 18 and 19. The Jews then said to him, what sign do you show us as your authority for doing these kind of things? They always want authority. They want authority from John the Baptist. They want authority from Jesus. What makes you, what allows you to do this kind of thing? Verse 19. He says to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. That designation by his disciples, Christ's zeal for his Father's house, is not his desire to preserve the present system. The present system, if used properly, would lead people to Messiah. Its abuse and misrepresentation is what led to this cleansing. Jesus, in fact, if you look at the story, he's really the only one who is guarding its divine purpose. But as is typical, the religious crowd, they get it all wrong. Their objectives have distorted their souls. It is religious to them. That's all this temple is. It's religious to them. It's not spiritual. It's not godly. And the religious implications and the financial implications, they're all meshed together for them. They want to know, what is your authority in doing this? Because they have built themselves a great religious edifice. It's earthly, it's material, but man, it is seductive. And that's what all religions are. That is what all religions do. Religion seduces. It seduces the lost soul. It puts us and the things that we build or accomplish at the center of our lives and our purpose. Jesus, he wants to come along and cleanse all of that with something eternal and supernatural and spiritual. And because that will be misunderstood by some, Jesus gets ridiculed, as he does here in verse 20. The Jews said to him, it took 46 years to build this temple. You're going to raise it up in 3 days? You can kind of picture the sarcasm in that. And also, you've got to remember what they would be thinking there. Remember, they're thinking earthly, material, immediate, seductively. This temple, the construction started in 19 BC under Herod the Great, the Herod the First. He was the first Herod, not the Herod who was in power when Jesus comes on the scene. They spent time remodeling. This is actually the temple of Zerubbabel that they are remodeling here again. So the temple of Zerubbabel has now stood for another 400 years. The main part of the remodeling was finished in 4 BC, about the time that Jesus was born. But other residual work continued on this temple for another 66 years until 63 AD. So when Jesus visits here now, it's been, as they say, 46 years under some kind of construction, and there's another 36 years of it to go. So yeah, this is really a big deal to them. The issue for them is to keep all of this intact. That's the issue. Here's the outcome. The outcome is it reveals Jesus' goal, and that is to die for the sins of man, to rise again, and to offer everlasting life for the asking. We see this in part in the commentary that John made. Look at verse 21 down to verse 23. This is John's comments that actually come later. He says, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, what's that? That's like 3 years down the road now. So when he's raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, during the feast, many believed in his name, observing his signs which he was doing. So John is admitting, we only really got the whole meaning of this after he died and after he was raised from the dead. That old system of worship had to be demoted, not redesigned. The reason why it just couldn't be reformed is because it was never meant to last. It had no power to sustain itself forever. It was never made to. It could never correct man's problem of sin. It could only frustrate us in our sin by constantly telling us we're wrong. And there's another bloody animal that you're going to have to kill here. That's why religion doesn't work. Expect to give me eternal confidence in all my effort. But you know what happens? It always frustrates me. It always seems like I keep pouring fresh water into the dirty, and it might seem okay for a while, but when I taste it, it's still dirty. And it leaves me wanting and needing more. Jesus' immediate goal was accomplished, as we see in verse 23 here. People were believing in him because of the signs that he was performing, not because the temple and its system had given anyone any real assurance. Think about this as well. Can you imagine the agony of soul that many would have experienced in their religious lives if any of them had lived from this time up until about 70 AD? Agony that would have taken place when after 82 years of a reconstruction of the temple into this grand brick and stone and precious metals and precious wood monument, and it was a grand architectural feat, absolutely was. Can you imagine that the Romans come in and they completely destroy it in 70 AD? They pull it down brick by brick during the Jewish-Roman wars. Incredible. And it was never rebuilt since then. It stood fully completed for only 7 years. And you know what? That's the best thing that ever could have happened to them, was for the Romans to come in and destroy it. It came at the expense of destroying their fragile, self-made destiny. So here's the question, as we kind of try to tie this all up here this morning. Here's a question we could ask. Have you confused, or maybe you're a believer and you've brought someone alongside of you and you're trying to share the gospel with them. Have you confused the life of religious activity? Or you could add in there secular activity. Maybe you got nothing to do with religion, but boy, you know what it is to live a secular life. Have you confused all of that activity with that of a true life of fulfillment? Because Jesus gives confidence based on his merit, his work, and not mine. When I press myself to keep all of my religious life intact or my secular life intact, maybe I've got nothing to do with religion. Maybe life for me is just working my 5 days a week, and I come home on Friday and I get together with my buddies and I drink a bunch of brewskis, and oh man, that is just so awesome. But by Saturday and Sunday, I'm like burned out, and it's like another Monday's rolling around, and I'm going to start this whole cycle over again. And I might do this for decades, and I wake up one day and I'm 42 years old going, what happened to the last 20 years? Where did it all go? When I press myself to keep my religious life intact, I'm always disappointed because I can never hold on to it for very long. So what I end up doing is either I will just kind of give it all up and I don't pursue it anymore, or worse, I lower my standards. Even the troubled Christian who has a less than productive Christian life gets confused by these kind of conflicting objectives. That sweet wine of life, they could say to themselves. I remember it. I remember when I once drank from Jesus. Man, it was awesome. But for some reason in the past few months, few years, seems to have soured because somewhere along the path in life, I've settled for the cheaper stuff. My recommendation, simply go back to the head waiter and tell him, please, I need the good stuff. Give me the good stuff. You know what? He will. He'll pour it out, overflowing and free. But for you, or maybe someone you're trying to reach, who's built up a temple in your life, I'm here to tell you, it won't last. You will constantly be doing repairs on it. And every repair that you do, another one is coming. It will leave you disappointed and worn out. Here's what I recommend to you. Let Jesus tear it all down for you. If you do that, he will rebuild in your life an everlasting one, born of his Spirit and of his power. And you will become the temple which God will now indwell permanently by his Spirit if you will just reach out to him in faith. If you do that, I guarantee you, no force in heaven and earth will ever overcome you. Let's stand and let's close in a song, and then we'll close in prayer.